Letting your sourdough bread proof in the fridge overnight is a great way to build up complex flavor in your sourdough bread. But what do you do the next day? Do you let your dough come up to room temperature, then score it and bake it? Or do you score and bake your dough directly from the fridge? That's what I do. But today I'm going to test these two methods to see if there's any noticeable difference in the bread. I've got two identical loaves of sourdough bread here. This is my medium hydration sourdough bread recipe, which I'll link in the description. Both doughs have been cold proofing in the fridge overnight at around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. To get a little more precise, I'm actually going to take the temperature of these two doughs to see what the internal temperature of the dough is before baking. And the one on the right is coming out to about 39 degrees Fahrenheit, so a little colder than 40, which is what my fridge is set to. And the dough on the left is actually reading even colder than 39. It's about 36 or 37 degrees Fahrenheit. So my fridge might actually have cold spots in certain parts of the fridge that I should be aware of. I might even consider adjusting the temperature settings in my fridge just so it doesn't get so cold in there. So for this dough on the left, I'm going to bake it right away while the dough is still cold. And for the dough on the right, I'm going to let it come up to room temperature, about 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius before I bake it. I honestly don't know how long that's going to take, so I'm just going to cover the dough up and let it sit out and warm up. So about 30 minutes ago, I preheated my oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit with the Dutch oven inside. I'm using my Challenger bread pan, and I've got a baking steel underneath the bread pan, which helps keep the bottom of the bread from burning. Once the oven was preheated, I just flipped out the cold dough onto some parchment paper, cleaned off the excess flour from the top of the dough. Then I scored the dough with my bread lamb, just one long slash from end to end, just following the standard procedure that I usually follow. And then I carefully transferred that dough into the hot Dutch oven, covered it up with the lid to trap the steam, and then I baked that at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, I removed the lid of the Dutch oven, released the steam, and admired the oven spring. Then I continued baking for another 15 minutes at 500 degrees. Then I just removed the bread carefully and placed it on a wire rack to cool. And this is exactly what I'm used to seeing with my bread. Pretty good oven spring, a nice ear on the loaf. I'm interested to see if the room temperature dough will turn out any differently. Okay, so this dough has been out on the counter. I'm trying to get it up to room temperature. It's been on the counter for 4 hours at this point, and every time I check it, it's still not reading 68 degrees Fahrenheit or room temperature. So I'm gonna see how high we are at this point after 4 hours. Okay, I think we're hovering at around 62 degrees. So even though it's not fully at room temperature yet, the dough is definitely rising in the Banneton basket, and I'm afraid it's gonna stick to the sides if I let it go any longer than this. So we're just gonna call that good enough. I've got the oven preheated, so I'm gonna bake this. I'm just flipping the dough out of the Banneton basket and onto a sheet of parchment paper. There's definitely more sticking going on to the side of the basket. That's definitely a downside to this dough compared to the cold dough. Just brushing off a little bit of the excess flour, and then sliding the whole thing onto a cutting board because I realized the parchment paper was way too small to pick up. That's my bad. Then I just score this dough with one long slash, just like the cold dough. This one's definitely a little bit harder to cut through. When dough's at room temperature, I tend to have that problem. Then I'm just going to carefully transfer this to the hot Challenger bread pan to bake. Again, this preheated for 30 minutes at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, just like the other dough. Slide the dough in, cover it up with the lid to trap the steam. Then I'm going to bake this for 20 minutes at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. 20 minutes later, just going to take the lid off to release the steam and admire the oven spring and ear. This dough really perked up. It's got a nice ear. I'm going to continue baking that for another 15 minutes at 500, and then I'm going to move this bread to the same wire rack to finish cooling for another couple of hours. I do see some pretty big differences in these two breads, and I was actually quite surprised at what I saw, so I'm going to talk about those in just a little bit. All right, the breads have had time to cool down, and this one on the left was the dough that I baked cold, and the one on the right was the dough that came up to room temperature before being baked. The first thing I want to compare is the color of these two loaves. The one on the left, the cold dough, ended up being a little bit lighter brown, and the one on the right was just a lot darker in color. Since I preheated the oven to the same temperature for the same amount of time, and each loaf was baked for the same amount of time, my mind tells me that the room temperature dough just got hotter faster in the oven, and that's why it's darker. If you've got a more scientific explanation for that, please let me know in the comments. All right, let's talk size. There is no denying that the bread on the right, which was the room temperature dough, just looks a lot bigger. Even though the raw dough weight was exactly the same for each loaf, about 885 grams, and the final weight of each bread was almost exactly exactly the same, about 745 grams for each loaf. So why does the loaf that I let come up to room temperature look so much bigger than the one that was baked cold? I think I know the answer to that question, and I think I know a workaround I could do to get the loaf on the left to look bigger just like the loaf on the right. I'm going to explain that idea at the end of this video when I give you my final thoughts. The loaf on the left, the cold dough loaf, ended up expanding really big, but it didn't have that great of an ear. And the loaf on the right, the room temperature dough, had a great ear, but it didn't quite expand as much as the other one. It clearly didn't have as much room to grow because it had proof so much in the Banneton basket at room temperature. As far as how the breads looked on the outside, I think I've got to give it to the room temperature dough for this one. Now let's look at the crumb on each of these loaves. This is the loaf that came from the cold dough. And it's not Instagram impressive, but this is what I'm used to getting. Kind of a closed crumb, but it's pretty even throughout the loaf of bread. And here's the other side of the loaf, pretty much the same thing. Now let's check out the loaf that came from the room temperature dough. Let me cut it open, see the inside, show you what there is to see. And the crumb on this loaf looks very similar, but it doesn't look quite as tight. You see how the room temperature loaf on the right just looks a little bit more natural than the one on the left. The loaf on the left just looks a little bit more condensed. So I'd say as far as crumb goes, the room temperature loaf wins again. So when you're cold proofing your sourdough bread, do you have to let it come up to room temperature? I'd say that's a definitive no. You do not have to let it come up to room temperature before you bake it. Either loaf, either method is going to get you a pretty solid loaf of bread. The biggest reason I say you shouldn't let it come up to room temperature is that it actually takes a really long time before it even reaches room temperature once it's been in the fridge for a while. I was at 4 hours and the dough still wasn't even at room temperature. There are also some other pros to using the cold dough method. The dough is really easy to handle when it's cold and straight out of the fridge. You can move it around on the parchment paper very easily, and the blade that you're scoring your dough with is just gonna slide right through the cold dough. Plus, it's just easy to grab the Banneton basket straight from the fridge and bake right away. You don't have to worry about taking it out and letting it sit for a few hours. But the dough that I did let come up to room temperature really did end up looking quite a bit better. I think it was more attractive on the outside and even a little bit more attractive on the inside of the loaf as well. And I think that all comes down to how much this dough was able to fill out inside of the Banneton basket. When I took it out of the fridge in the morning and I let it essentially proof in the Banneton basket at room temperature for 4 hours, this really filled up the Banneton and was able to take the shape of the Banneton and just ended up looking a lot bigger, even though it was the exact same size of dough. It was the same weight of dough. So I think the secret to getting a larger looking loaf, if you're gonna do a cold proof in the fridge, is to allow your dough to proof at room temperature in the Banneton basket for some amount of time. For my standard sourdough procedure, I usually just take my dough, shape it, and put it in the Banneton, and then I move that straight to the fridge. I think if I would let it proof at room temperature for a little bit before I put it in the fridge, maybe for an hour or so, it would fill up the Banneton basket a little bit more, and then when I bake it the next morning, it would look a lot bigger. I could either do that before I put it in the fridge or let it come up to room temperature after I put it in the fridge. So I think there's something there. If you want to shape your dough, put it in the Banneton basket, allow it to proof and puff up a little bit, then move it to the fridge, you could still bake your dough cold the next morning. It'll have all the benefits of being cold dough. You can score it easily, you can move it easily, but it'll also end up looking a little bit bigger. I haven't tested this yet, but that's my suspicion that the dough will end up looking a little bit bigger if it's had a chance to fill out the Banneton basket. I'm just rambling at this point, and I don't want to make this sound more complicated than it needs to be because either method is going to give you a great loaf of bread. If you want to just bake it cold straight from the fridge, if you want to let it proof in the basket for a little bit and come up to room temperature, that's totally fine. I encourage you to try this out for yourself at home. If you bake a few loaves a week, why not try a few different methods and see which one turns out best for you? As always, you can use my recipes from this YouTube channel. I've got 2 great recipes for you to try right up here. I'll see you in the next video.